this is an extremely complex movie that deserves, and I think I said some of this before, but I think that deserves analysis from the perspective of writing, from the perspective of stories, just the writing, the dialogue, what is said. I think there's some fantastic dialogue in it. The writing from the perspective of the story structure, the writing, but the directing deserves to be talked about. This movie deserves to be talked about in terms of a cultural perspective, that the things that it references historically, but also from the perspective of what it represented and referenced contemporary to its time. And Nicholas Meyer talks about that as well when he was doing the director's commentary about all movies, movies being references to its time. And so this is talking about not only history, but in its day, the current day. It deserves to be talked about there. And it deserves to be talked about in terms of the development of the Star Trek characters. This is one of the greats.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. Like I said, it was the only one done in the 90s. It was following up really the first dud from the Star Trek franchise. Star Trek 1 wasn't well received, but it still had a historical role in that new sci-fi era that was being launched by Star Trek in 2001, I guess you could include in some respects. And so it was still in that vein. And Star Trek 2, obviously, 3 and 4, that was considered the trilogy. And then 5 kind of was kind of a little bit of a nosedive there. So this had to follow that up, which I think it did a great job. I remember being very excited about this one because the trailer really sold this movie, and there was a lot of excitement. It had good word of mouth. So, and Heath, you nailed it. There's also a historical tie into this, which is unmistakable. It's not brilliant to say that there's a lot of crossover with Star Trek 6 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and what I believe also is a tie-in of Chernobyl from 1986, the Chernobyl disaster. I felt like the writers were hyper-conscious of drawing a parallel to the Soviet Union and this idea of a double hegemonic galactic order in which one of the superpowers is collapsing under their own weight. And now you've got this lone superpower in the Federation, and what are we going to do about it? And some of the dialogue in this is so awesome that when I go back to watch it, I actually learn a lot. I even feel like there's commentary there where our culture, through the characters of Star Trek 6, are wrestling with that question, what now? And we'll get into this later. Kirk references something called the end of history. And that's not an accident. That's an actual phrase and an intellectual line of thought on what to do next. And these were not small ideas. And because of this movie, I have actually gone on to read literature based specifically on that phrase, the end of history. I went down a rabbit hole a couple years ago.
Fukuyama.
What's that?
Fukuyama, right?
Correct. So I went down a rabbit hole and I realized that there were major intellectual heavyweights trying to figure out what this meant, that the United States was the last one standing, that the World War II had been won, the Cold War had been won, and here America stands alone. The good guys won, right? That was the idea in 1990, 1991. Now what? Now what?
And do we stand at the end of history?
The end of history, right. So, and this is kind of weird now that I think about it. One of the books that I read that this is related to was called Revolt of the Elites. And some of this even pertains to today. It was written by Christopher Leish. And oddly enough, he had some commentary about, totally out of place, but strippers and psychological profiles of strippers, which I ended up using to write my historical fiction book with Empress Theodora. It was pretty phenomenal. But I actually read some of the literature out of the 90s because of this film, because it really got me thinking, because I feel like here we are, 2023. In some ways, we're still trying to answer that question. What are we supposed to be doing now? You know, what does it mean to be the superpower? Do we attack terrorists? You know, do we set up an authoritarian, heavy duty equality super state? Like, what are we supposed to do? We still haven't answered the question. And these questions were first asked in 1991, and they're front and center in Star Trek 6.
I think that is an excellent point, Doug. I wrote my master's thesis on geopolitics, and then also had elements of that when I did theories of statehood for my PhD. And so
Wow.
I traced this. And so the end of history was a major part of that. And actually, I've wondered in the realm of nonfiction, which is totally not what I'm doing anymore, but in the realm of nonfiction, if I could continue that arc, because I had documented an arc of geopolitical thought, through, pre-World War II and World War I, up through, and the way things, and I can see that even going on today. So that progresses through the end of history and what is the predominant geopolitical and geostrategic thought, of the West, and then also other places as it compares, but the Western thought throughout all these times. And if you were to do, what is the word I should be using? Oh my God, I can't believe I forget the term right now, but there's a certain element of geopolitical thought which looks at modern art, basically. And I remember reading a bunch of different articles, and there were a bunch of different articles that came out about how does modern art, including cinema, which includes film, represent different elements, different geopolitical elements. This is an element of critical geopolitics. And so, but I don't remember this film being analyzed, but it absolutely should have been. It absolutely should have been, because you have to situate this film in that context when you're looking at it just as the history of film.
So, and I'll even say that I totally agree with that. This should be a prominent film that is studied, because this is a major franchise in popular culture. This is Captain Kirk's final ride, and Spock. I guess Spock comes back, but I don't even really count all that, really. But this was a real last hurrah by this crew. So this was a pop culture event, in my opinion, in terms of a farewell to this crew. And unlike most franchises, I feel like with this film, they stuck the landing.
They stuck the landing. Yes,
they stuck the landing. And I think it should be filmed or studied, because how many times today do we hear, God, get politics out of my movies? And I have thought this and asked this myself, but there are politics in other films. Why am I so over? The question is it one-sided? Do the filmmakers say, we have the answer, here it is, stuff it down your throat? One-sided political conjectures, straw man theories, and where it doesn't feel very natural, nor does it feel very well thought out. However, Star Trek 6, this movie is a great example where they don't tell you the answer, because they see consistently, I'll point out certain parts of dialogue, they don't try to just demonize the disagreeing parties. They choose their winner in a sense, but they do so, and they also make a very strong attempt to help you understand why Valeris would do this, why Chang would do this. There's that line later, Starfleet and Klingons conspiring together. There was kind of this amazing awareness of a strange common cause. So I feel like they did their best to present the logic that they were against, but present it in a sympathetic way, as though they understood why people would think this way, and why ultimately this might not have been the way to go. And the characters had to grow to get through this very clearly. There's a great, and we'll get to it, but there's a great line in the end where she goes, where Azet Bor says, "You've restored my father's faith," and he said, "And you've restored my son's." Huge lines in terms of reconciliation from people who are diametrically opposed to each other, in a sense, now coming together. So there's a lot here in Star Trek 6 for us to think about.
I think that is an excellent point, Doug. And I hadn't thought about that deliberately like you just phrased it, but I think it should absolutely be thought about, because this is 1991. So this movie came out in 1991. And if people are like, oh, I don't want politics in my Star Trek or whatever. Well, here is a film that is just beloved, that we think is, fantastic. And it also, generally thought to be one of the best of them. There's absolutely political commentary, as others have been. So why do people accept this one with open arms and not other things? Man, that's something we got to think about. That's
because the writers made the effort to understand people they may disagree with. We've lost the art of that today, and that's a major problem. I hear some people, it doesn't matter which side of the spectrum you're on, you'll hear people just talk about the other side as if there is no logic to it. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's very important to understand both sides just for yourself. I don't know how you can make a weighted decision if you don't understand the logic of both sides. This movie presents logic to both sides, even though there are bad guys and everything like that. They present it as there is a line of logic that makes sense. You know, Bill, are we talking about mothballing the Starfleet? You know what? Are we going to give up on everything? And there's a great line, and it really hit me hard last night when I watched it. She goes, when Valeris and Spock are talking, she's like, we must recognize that a turning point has been reached in the affairs of the Federation. And I was like, man, that's actually a big thing for a character to say. A turning point has been reached in the affairs of the Federation. That means your cultural goals, your cultural purpose, you've reached the turning point where everything you're doing, all of your logic, all of your focus, all of your attention, all of your outreach now must change.
Which is the end of history, which is what Fukama was saying when he was talking about that in that article about the end of history, that like we've reached a turning point in the affairs of the United States and the Western culture in general.
And global culture.
Have won. Yeah, that what has happened here, that yes, it's, you know, and I think about, well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the commentary here was done in the context of the fall of the Soviet Union and the what next moment. But here we are in 2023. And when I look back, I'm like, that was a bigger pivotal moment than we all knew it meant a lot. We all understood that. But now we have, 30, how many years has it been since 1996? We're almost at 30 years. There's that big question. I realize it's a bigger weight to carry for our society to wrestle with that. And I think that such turning points are so rare in history, so clear and concise, that the effort made in Star Trek VI to address this means that Star Trek stumbled into one of the great questions of all civilization, when a civilization achieves its goals. What next? That's such a major question. So, and Star Trek VI is right on that pulse throughout the whole film. And I love it. Star Trek VI does an exceptional job, in my opinion, of trying to make the case, even if they disagree, make the case for why the conspiracy occurred and why there was some logic to restarting this Cold War in space and just having this Federation and Klingons slug it out. Klingons wanted it, or some members of the Klingon Empire wanted it. Some members of Starfleet wanted it. There's a logic there. There's a sensibility there. There's a desire not to change, which is a theme in this story, in this movie. So anyway, I agree.